The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of London as Margaret Thompson clutched her worn leather purse tighter against her chest. At 73 years old, she had witnessed many changes in her beloved city, but nothing could have prepared her for the devastating news that would soon shake the entire nation. Margaret lived alone in a small flat overlooking the Thames, the same apartment where she had raised her 3 children after her husband passed away 25 years earlier. Her days were simple but meaningful: morning tea while watching the sunrise, afternoon walks through Hyde Park, and evenings spent knitting scarves for the local homeless shelter. She had always found comfort in routine, especially after losing her youngest son David in a car accident just 2 years prior. On this particular Tuesday morning, Margaret was making her usual trip to the local grocery store when she noticed something unusual. People were gathering around shop windows, their faces pale and expressions somber. Some were wiping away tears, while others stood in stunned silence, staring at the television screens displaying breaking news. "What's happening?" Margaret asked Mrs. Rodriguez, her neighbor who was standing outside the bakery with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Rodriguez could barely speak through her sobs. "There's been a terrible accident," she whispered. "A school bus. Children." She couldn't finish the sentence before breaking down completely. Margaret's heart sank as she learned the devastating details. A school bus carrying 42 children from St. Upper Mary's Primary School had been involved in a catastrophic accident during their field trip to the countryside. The bus had skidded on wet roads during an unexpected storm and crashed into a ravine. Emergency responders had worked through the night, but the news was heartbreaking. 15 children had lost their lives, and many others were fighting for survival in hospitals across London. The entire nation seemed to pause as the tragedy unfolded. Television networks interrupted regular programming to provide continuous coverage. Social media was flooded with messages of grief, support, and prayers for the families affected. The accident had touched every corner of British society, from small villages to major cities, as people struggled to comprehend such an immense loss of young life. Margaret found herself drawn to St. Mary's Primary School, located just a few miles from her flat. She had never visited the school before, but something compelled her to go there. As she approached the building, she saw hundreds of people had gathered outside the gates. Flowers, teddy bears, cards, and balloons were piling up against the fence as members of the community came to pay their respects. Among the crowd, Margaret noticed families holding photographs of their children, some crying openly while others stood in numb silence. There were teachers from other schools, local business owners, retired couples, teenagers, and people from all walks of life. The tragedy had united them in their shared grief and desire to show support for the grieving families. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old mother of 2, stood near the school gates holding a bouquet of white roses. Her 7-year-old daughter Emma attended a different school, but Sarah couldn't shake the thought that it could have been Emma on that bus. She had taken the day off work to come to St. Mary's, needing to do something, anything, to honor the memory of the children who had died. "I keep thinking about their parents," Sarah said to Margaret as they stood side by side. "How do you survive losing your child? How do you even begin to cope with that kind of pain?" Margaret nodded, remembering her own grief after losing David. "You don't get over it," she said softly. "You learn to carry it. But knowing that others care, that the whole community is standing with you, it does help, even when it doesn't feel like anything could help." As the day progressed, more people continued to arrive. Local restaurants and cafes sent volunteers with free food and drinks for those keeping vigil. Churches opened their doors for prayer services. Community centers organized collection drives for the affected families. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but everyone felt it still wasn't enough to match the magnitude of the loss. Television crews captured the growing memorial outside St. Mary's, and the images were broadcast around the world. Other countries sent messages of sympathy and support. The hashtag #SaintMaryStrong began trending globally as people shared memories, prayers, and messages of hope. Father Patrick O'Malley, the priest at the local Catholic church, had been at the school since early morning, offering comfort to anyone who needed it. He had performed many difficult duties in his 30 years as a priest, but comforting parents who had lost their children was always the hardest. He moved through the crowd quietly, offering prayers, hugs, and simply listening to those who needed to talk. "This community has always been strong," Father O'Malley told a television reporter. "We've faced challenges before, but nothing like this. What I'm seeing today, though, gives me hope. When tragedy strikes, people don't turn away. They come together. They show up for each other." As evening approached, candles began to appear in the crowd. Someone had started organizing a candlelight vigil, and word spread quickly through social media and local news. By sunset, thousands of people had gathered, each holding a small candle as they stood in respectful silence. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Thousands of flickering flames illuminating faces marked by tears and determination. People sang hymns, shared stories about the children they had lost, and simply stood together in solidarity. The vigil lasted well into the night, with many people refusing to leave until every candle had burned out. Margaret stayed until the very end, her arthritis causing her legs to ache, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She thought about David, and how the community had rallied around her family after his death. She remembered the meals that appeared on her doorstep, the cards that filled her mailbox, the neighbors who simply sat with her when words weren't enough. During the vigil, people began sharing stories about the children who had died. 7-year-old Tommy Williams had wanted to be a firefighter and spent his free time drawing pictures of fire trucks. 9-year-old Lucy Chen was learning to play the violin and had just performed her first solo at the school concert. 8-year-old Marcus Johnson loved football and had scored the winning goal for his team just the week before. Each story brought fresh tears, but also smiles as people remembered the joy these children had brought to their families and communities. Their teacher, Miss Roberts, who had also died in the accident, was remembered as someone who made learning fun and always had time to help struggling students. The families of the deceased children found strength in hearing these stories. They realized that their children's lives had touched more people than they had ever imagined. The outpouring of love and support from complete strangers helped them feel less alone in their overwhelming grief. As midnight approached and the crowd slowly dispersed, Margaret walked home through the quiet streets. The city felt different somehow. Heavier with grief, but also somehow more connected. She had witnessed something remarkable that day, a community's capacity to come together in the face of unimaginable tragedy. But Margaret had no idea that the most powerful moment of unity and healing was yet to come. Tomorrow would bring an unexpected gesture that would capture the hearts of not just London, not just Britain, but people around the world. A simple act of compassion from two people who understood that sometimes the most meaningful support comes not from grand gestures, but from showing up and standing with those who are suffering. The royal family had been monitoring the situation closely, deeply moved by the tragedy and the community's response. Behind the palace walls, conversations were taking place about how best to support the grieving families and honor the memory of the children who had died. What was being planned was something unprecedented, something that would demonstrate that even in their elevated position, they shared in the nation's grief and wanted to offer whatever comfort they could provide. As Margaret finally reached her flat and prepared for bed, she said a prayer for the families who would face their first night without their children. She prayed for the survivors fighting for their lives in hospital beds, and she prayed for her community that they would continue to support each other through the difficult days ahead. Outside her window, London continued to mourn, but it also continued to hope. The foundation of love and support that had been built that day would prove strong enough to carry everyone through the challenges that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new expressions of compassion that would remind everyone that in the darkest times, the human capacity for kindness shines brightest. The morning after the vigil, London woke to a gray, drizzly day that seemed to match the collective mood of the city. Margaret Thompson rose earlier than usual, unable to sleep through her normal hours. The images from yesterday, the faces of grieving parents, the growing memorial of flowers and teddy bears, the thousands of candles flickering in the darkness, replayed in her mind like scenes from a heartbreaking film. She made her tea and settled by her window overlooking the Thames. The river looked particularly dark this morning, its surface disturbed by the gentle rain. Margaret watched the early commuters hurrying across the bridges with their umbrellas, and she wondered how many of them had been at the vigil last night, how many were carrying the weight of yesterday's tragedy as they tried to return to their normal routines. Across the city, Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood in her private study at Kensington Palace, looking out at her own rain-soaked garden. She had been awake since 4 a.m, unable to stop thinking about the families who had lost their children. As a mother of 3 herself, the tragedy had hit her with devastating force. She kept imagining George, Charlotte, and Louis, and the thought of something happening to them made her feel physically ill. William found her there an hour later, standing perfectly still with her arms wrapped around herself. He didn't need to ask what she was thinking about. He had been having the same thoughts all night. The couple had discussed the tragedy extensively over dinner the previous evening, both struggling with how to appropriately respond to such an enormous loss. "We have to do something," Catherine said quietly when she heard William enter the room. "Not because we're expected to, but because... how can we not?" William nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. This wasn't about royal duty or public expectations. This was about being human beings who had been deeply affected by an unthinkable tragedy involving children. Both he and Catherine had been following the news coverage closely, reading every article, watching every report, and feeling increasingly moved by the community's response. "I've been thinking about that too," William replied, moving to stand beside his wife. "But what could we possibly do that would be meaningful? What could we offer that would actually help?" Catherine turned to look at him, her eyes red from the tears she had shed throughout the night. "I don't think it's about offering solutions or trying to fix anything. I think it's about showing up. Just being present with them." The idea that began forming in their conversation that morning was simple but unprecedented. Rather than sending official condolences or making a formal public statement, they would go to St. Mary's Primary School themselves. Not for a scheduled royal visit with all the usual protocol and media fanfare, but quietly, privately, as parents who were grieving alongside the community. They spent the morning making discreet arrangements with their security team and the local police. The goal was to visit the memorial outside the school without creating additional chaos or drawing attention away from the families who were mourning. They wanted to pay their respects just like any other members of the community. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Primary School, the memorial had grown even larger overnight. Despite the rain, people continued to arrive with flowers, cards, and photographs. The school had been closed indefinitely, but the building had become a focal point for the community's grief and healing process. Janet Williams, whose 7-year-old son Tommy had died in the accident, sat on a small folding chair someone had brought for her near the school gates. She had been there since dawn, needing to be close to her son's school even though she knew he would never walk through those doors again. Other parents of the victims had gathered as well, finding comfort in being together during this impossible time. "Tommy loved coming to school," Janet said to anyone who would listen. "Every morning he would run ahead of me to get here faster. He was so excited about everything, his friends, his teachers, learning new things. Yesterday was supposed to be the best day ever for him, visiting the farm and seeing all the animals." Her words were met with understanding nods and fresh tears from those around her. Everyone was struggling to comprehend how a day that had started with such joy and anticipation could have ended in such tragedy. Around noon, a few people in the crowd noticed some unusual activity near the street. Several black cars had pulled up discreetly, and there seemed to be more security personnel than usual. But the rain was getting heavier, and most people were focused on staying dry while maintaining their vigil. Then someone spotted them. Walking quietly toward the memorial, without any fanfare or announcement, were the Prince and Princess of Wales. They weren't dressed in formal royal attire. Catherine wore a simple black coat and William a dark umbrella jacket. They looked like any other couple who had come to pay their respects, except for the obvious security presence trying to maintain a respectful distance. Words spread through the crowd in whispers rather than excited shouts. People understood instinctively that this was not a celebration or photo opportunity. This was a moment of shared grief. The royal couple approached the memorial slowly, their faces showing the same sadness and devastation that everyone else felt. Catherine knelt down at the memorial, her coat getting soaked by the rain and wet ground. She carefully placed a simple bouquet of white flowers among the hundreds of others, taking time to read some of the messages that had been left by community members. William stood beside her, his head bowed in respectful silence. What happened next would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Janet Williams, Tommy's mother, recognized the royal couple and slowly approached them. Instead of curtsying or maintaining formal protocol, she simply walked up to Catherine, who was still kneeling by the flowers. "Your Highness," Janet said quietly, her voice broken by grief. Catherine looked up and immediately stood. Without hesitation, she reached out and embraced Janet in a long, heartfelt hug. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Both women cried as they held each other, one mother comforting another in the most basic human way possible. William, meanwhile, had been approached by several other parents. He listened intently as they shared memories of their children, his own eyes filling with tears as he heard about Tommy's dream of being a firefighter, Lucy's violin playing, and Marcus's love of football. He didn't offer empty platitudes or royal proclamations. He simply listened with his whole heart. "We're so sorry," Catherine said to Janet when they finally separated. "As parents ourselves, we can't imagine what you're going through. We just wanted you to know that you're not alone." The simplicity and sincerity of her words struck everyone who heard them. This wasn't a rehearsed royal statement. It was a genuine expression of sympathy from one parent to another. The royal couple spent nearly an hour at the memorial, speaking individually with as many families as possible. They listened to stories about the children who had died, met with some of the families of injured children, and thanked the community volunteers who had been providing support. What made the visit so powerful wasn't anything they said or any grand gesture they made. It was the fact that they had shown up in the rain without ceremony or media attention, simply to stand with their community in grief. They had used their position not to make speeches or announcements, but to provide comfort in the most personal way possible. Margaret Thompson, who had returned to the memorial that morning, watched the entire interaction from a distance. She saw how naturally Catherine hugged the grieving mothers, how William shook hands with fathers and grandfathers who were struggling to hold back tears. She witnessed the moment when Catherine knelt down to speak with a young survivor who had come to the memorial in a wheelchair, still recovering from her injuries. "I've never seen anything like it," Margaret whispered to Sarah Mitchell, who was standing beside her. "They're not here as the prince and princess. They're here as Mum and Dad." The rain continued to fall throughout the visit, but nobody seemed to notice. The royal couple became completely soaked, their formal appearance abandoned as they focused entirely on the people they had come to comfort. Security tried to offer umbrellas several times, but both William and Catherine declined, not wanting to create any barrier between themselves and the families they were meeting. As their visit concluded, the couple made one final gesture that would be talked about for years to come. Instead of leaving immediately, they joined the crowd in a moment of silence for the children who had died, standing in the rain with everyone else. They bowed their heads and remembered 15 young lives that had been cut tragically short. When they finally departed, they did so as quietly as they had arrived. There were no speeches, no formal statements, no photo opportunities. They simply got back in their cars and drove away, leaving behind a community that felt somehow less alone in their grief. The impact of their visit rippled through social media and news outlets within hours. But this time, the coverage was different. Instead of focusing on royal protocol or fashion choices, the media captured something much more powerful: authentic human compassion in action. Videos and photographs from the visit showed Catherine's coat muddy from kneeling at the memorial, William's hair wet from the rain, and both of them completely focused on the people they were comforting rather than any cameras or observers. The images were powerful because they showed vulnerability and genuine emotion rather than polished royal presentation. That evening, as Margaret walked home from her second day at the memorial, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Not hope that the tragedy could be undone or that the pain would disappear, but hope that in times of unimaginable darkness, people still had the capacity to show up for each other in profound ways. The royal visit had demonstrated something important to the entire community. Grief shared is grief diminished, and sometimes the most powerful support comes not from trying to fix things, but from simply bearing witness to someone else's pain and letting them know they are not alone. Tomorrow would bring new developments as the impact of William and Catherine's gesture continued to spread, inspiring others and creating ripple effects that would reach far beyond the borders of London or even Britain itself. The impact of the royal couple's visit became clear within hours of their departure from St. Mary's Primary School. Social media platforms exploded with posts, photos, and videos from people who had witnessed their quiet act of compassion. But unlike typical royal coverage, these posts weren't about fashion, protocol, or ceremony. They were about genuine human connection during a time of profound grief. Margaret Thompson returned home that evening to find her phone ringing constantly. Her granddaughter Emma, who lived in Manchester, had seen the news coverage and wanted to hear about what Margaret had witnessed firsthand. "Grandma, the videos are everywhere," Emma said excitedly through the phone. "Everyone is talking about how real they were, how they actually cared. People are saying it's changed everything about how they see the royal family." Margaret settled into her favorite chair, still processing what she had witnessed. "It wasn't about them being royal," she explained to Emma. "It was about them being human. You could see it in their faces. They were genuinely heartbroken for those families." Across London and throughout Britain, similar conversations were taking place. The authenticity of William and Catherine's response had touched something deep in the national consciousness. In a time when public figures often seemed distant and disconnected, their willingness to share in genuine grief had created a powerful moment of unity. Janet Williams, Tommy's mother, found herself at the center of media attention after her emotional encounter with Catherine. News outlets wanted to interview her about meeting the princess, but Janet had a different message to share. "She hugged me like any mother would hug another mother who was in pain," Janet told the BBC that evening. "She didn't say anything political or formal. She just let me cry on her shoulder. That hug meant everything to me because it reminded me that even in my darkest moment I wasn't alone." The hospital where many of the injured children were recovering also felt the impact of the royal visit. Staff members reported that families seemed more hopeful, more surrounded by community support than before. The gesture had somehow given everyone permission to grieve openly while also believing in the power of human compassion. Dr. Sarah Ahmed, who was treating several of the injured children, explained to reporters, "What their Royal Highnesses did yesterday created a ripple effect. Families started opening up more, accepting help from counselors and support groups. It's as if seeing such prominent figures show vulnerability gave everyone else permission to be vulnerable too. The international response was equally powerful. News outlets from around the world covered the story, but the focus remained on the humanity of the moment rather than royal protocol. Social media users from dozens of countries shared their own stories of community support during difficult times, inspired by what they had seen in London. In France, a group of parents who had lost children in various tragedies organized a memorial service inspired by the London Vigil. In Australia, a community that had experienced flooding came together for mutual support, specifically mentioning the royal couple's example of showing up during difficult times. The gesture had somehow transcended national boundaries to become a symbol of how people could support each other during crisis. 3 days after their visit, Kensington Palace released a brief statement. Not a formal royal proclamation, but a simple, heartfelt message from William and Catherine personally. "We were deeply moved by the strength and compassion we witnessed at St. Mary's Primary School. The families who welcomed us in their darkest hour showed incredible grace. We will continue to hold all those affected by this tragedy in our thoughts and prayers. The community's response has reminded us all of the power of coming together during difficult times." Even this statement was notable for what it didn't include. No formal language, no references to royal duties or obligations, just a genuine expression of continued care and support. Father Patrick O'Malley, who had been providing counseling support to many of the affected families, observed significant changes in the days following the royal visit. "People seemed to carry themselves differently," he noted. "There was still tremendous grief. That didn't disappear. But there was also this sense of being part of something larger, of being held by a community that extended far beyond what they had imagined." Margaret had been visiting the memorial every day since the tragedy, and she noticed these changes too. The conversations were different now. People talked not just about their grief, but about their hope for healing. They shared stories of kindness they had witnessed or received. They talked about how the royal couple's visit had made them feel seen and valued. On the 4th day after the royal visit, something unexpected happened. Children from other schools began arriving at the memorial, not with their parents, but as organized groups led by teachers and volunteers. They came with handmade cards, drawings, and flowers they had picked themselves. 8-year-old Sophie from a neighboring school had drawn a picture of children playing together with angels watching over them. "I wanted the mums and dads to know that their children are still playing, just in heaven now," she explained, as she carefully placed her drawing among the memorial tributes. These visits from other children brought a new dimension to the healing process. The parents of the victims found unexpected comfort in seeing that their children's memory was inspiring kindness and compassion in other young people. It helped them feel that their children's lives had meaning that would continue to influence others. The memorial itself evolved during this time. What had started as a collection of flowers and teddy bears became something more organized and permanent. Local artists volunteered to create a more lasting tribute. Community leaders worked with the school district to establish a foundation in memory of the children who had died. William and Catherine's gesture had catalyzed something larger than anyone could have anticipated. Their willingness to show authentic emotion and vulnerability had given an entire community permission to grieve openly while also working together toward healing. 2 weeks after the tragedy, the first of the injured children was released from the hospital. 9-year-old Emma Carter, who had suffered a broken leg and some internal injuries, was finally well enough to go home. Her parents brought her to see the memorial, and she was amazed by the outpouring of love from people she had never met. "All these people care about us?" Emma asked her mother as they looked at the thousands of messages, drawings, and flowers. "Yes, sweetheart," her mother replied. "When something terrible happens, sometimes it brings out the very best in people. They want to help however they can." Emma spent a long time reading the messages, especially the ones from other children. She was particularly moved by the cards that came from schools in other countries, showing her that compassion had no boundaries. Margaret, now a regular fixture at the memorial, met Emma and her family that day. She had brought knitted scarves for the families, the same type she usually made for the homeless shelter, but she wanted to do something personal for the people who were grieving. "My grandson was about your age when he died," Margaret told Emma gently. "It was different circumstances, but I know how precious children are. I wanted you to know that there are people who care about you who have never even met you." Emma hugged Margaret tightly, and her parents were moved to tears by the kindness of this elderly woman who had been showing up every day to support families she didn't know. The ripple effects of William and Catherine's gesture continued to spread in unexpected ways. Other public figures began following their example of authentic personal responses to community tragedies. Politicians started showing up at disaster sites not for photo opportunities, but for genuine support. Celebrities began using their platforms to highlight community heroes rather than promoting themselves. The media coverage also shifted. Instead of focusing solely on the tragedy itself, news outlets began highlighting the positive responses it had generated: the volunteers, the donations, the acts of kindness between strangers, the ways communities were coming together. 6 months later, Margaret received an unexpected letter in her mail. It was from Kensington Palace, but it wasn't a form letter or official communication. Catherine had written a personal note thanking Margaret for her daily presence at the memorial and for the support she had provided to the affected families. "Your consistent presence and kindness exemplified the very best of community spirit," Catherine wrote. "People like you are the ones who truly help families heal during impossible times. Thank you for showing us all what it means to love our neighbors." Margaret read the letter multiple times, tears streaming down her face. She had never expected recognition for simply doing what felt right. The fact that the princess had noticed her daily visits and taken time to acknowledge them personally meant more than any formal honor could have. The memorial at St. Mary's Primary School was eventually transformed into a permanent garden of remembrance. The families of the children who died worked with landscape designers to create a space that celebrated their children's lives while providing a peaceful place for reflection and healing. Each of the 15 children was honored with their own tree, planted in a circle around a central playground that was designed based on drawings the children had made in art class. It wasn't a somber, sad place. It was joyful and colorful, reflecting the energy and happiness the children had brought to their families and community. During the dedication ceremony for the garden, William and Catherine returned for another quiet visit. This time, they came to celebrate rather than mourn, joining families in planting the memorial trees and watching as children from other schools played on the new playground equipment. Janet Williams, Tommy's mother, had found new purpose in helping other families navigate grief and trauma. She had started a support group that met weekly at her local church, providing a safe space for parents who had lost children to share their experiences and support each other. "The day the prince and princess came to stand with us in the rain changed something fundamental for me," Janet explained to her support group. "It helped me understand that grief shared is not grief diminished, but grief transformed. Our pain doesn't go away, but it becomes part of something larger, part of love that connects us all." The story of William and Catherine's gesture had indeed moved millions, but not in the way typical royal news captured public attention. It had moved people because it demonstrated that authentic compassion could bridge any gap between royalty and commoners, between strangers and family, between devastating loss and healing hope. Margaret Thompson, now 84 years old, still visited the memorial garden regularly. She would sit on one of the benches that surrounded the playground and watch children play where the memorial flowers had once been placed. The sound of children's laughter had replaced the sound of weeping, but the love and community connection that had been forged during those dark days remained strong. Sometimes, Margaret would tell visitors to the garden, it takes something terrible to remind us how much love we're capable of sharing. Those children didn't die in vain if their story helps us remember to show up for each other when it matters most. The legacy of that rainy day when two people chose to show up as humans rather than royals continued to influence how communities respond to tragedy. It had shown the world that genuine compassion requires no title, no special training, no elaborate gestures, just the willingness to stand with others in their pain and let them know they are not alone. Years later, when people told the story of the St. Mary's School tragedy, they didn't focus primarily on the accident itself. They talked about the community that emerged from it, the love that was shared, the healing that became possible when people chose connection over isolation. And they always mentioned the moment when a prince and princess taught an entire nation that the most powerful response to grief is simply showing up with an open heart.